All right, today we're diving into one of the most radical, most extreme economic experiments ever attempted, war communism. We're talking about a period between 1918 and 1921 where the new government in Russia didn't just try to change the economy. They tried to completely erase the very idea of money, markets, and private property practically overnight.
And right away, that just begs the huge question that historians still wrestle with. Was this whole thing just a desperate, pragmatic move to win a brutal civil war? Or was it something more, a fanatical headfirst dive into building a communist utopia right then and there? Well, as we're about to see, the real answer is, it's a bit of a messy and frankly fascinating combination of the two.
So to really get why something so extreme could even happen, you have to transport yourself back to Russia in 1918. The Tsar? Gone. The Bolsheviks? They've just grabbed power. But don't picture some stable new government. Picture absolute chaos. The country isn't just unstable, it's a nation on its knees, literally teetering on the brink of total collapse. I mean, the new Bolshevik government was in an impossible situation. First off, they're fighting for their lives in a brutal multi-front civil war against this coalition called the White Army. On top of that, the economy, which was already wrecked by World War I, has just completely imploded. Trains aren't running. They've lost control of the areas that grow all the food. You have to understand, this wasn't just some political challenge. This was a fight for sheer survival.
And it's right here, in this absolute pressure cooker of chaos, that the policy of war communism is born. Think of it as a radical, all-in response where the desperate need to survive just smashed head-on into fiery revolutionary ideology.
So you really got two forces pushing this policy forward, kind of like two sides of the same coin. On one side, you have pure crisis management. We have to win this war. We have to feed the Red Army and the cities. We have to stop the economy from vanishing into thin air. But on the other side, well, a lot of Bolsheviks saw this chaos as the perfect chance to just do it, to jump straight into their ideal communist society. No more markets, no more money, let's centralize everything right now. And yeah, most historians today will tell you it wasn't one or the other, it was a powerful and dangerous mix of both. Okay, so what did this policy actually look like on the ground? How did it work day to day? Well, it basically rested on four really extreme pillars that were designed to fundamentally remake, well, every single part of Russian life. Okay, here are the big four. First, the government nationalized all industry, every last bit of it. Second, they started forcibly taking grain from the peasants. Third, they militarized the entire workforce. And fourth, they made a serious attempt to just get rid of money and private markets completely. So yeah, let's break each of those down a little more.
So, nationalization. And when they said nationalization, they meant it. This wasn't just about taking over the huge factories and coal mines. No, by 1920, the state owned pretty much everything, right down to the tiniest little workshop with maybe 2 or 3 employees. The whole idea was to rip out the market system and replace it with one single central government plan for the entire economy.
Now, this next one. This was probably the most brutal piece of the puzzle. It was called grain requisitioning. Basically, armed squads would go out into the countryside to seize any grain the government decided was surplus. But here's the thing. In practice, surplus often meant everything. They'd take it all, leaving the peasants with barely enough to survive and absolutely zero reason to bother planting more for next year. I mean, why would you?
And it wasn't just industries and grain the state took control of. It was people, too. Labor wasn't a job anymore, it was a mandatory duty. Workers were essentially treated like soldiers in an army. You couldn't strike, you couldn't quit, and the government could send you to work anywhere they wanted. It was, for all intents and purposes, a system of universal forced labor.
And if you want to understand the mindset behind this, just listen to this quote from Leon Trotsky, who is one of the main architects of the whole policy. It's pretty chilling. He's not even trying to hide it. He's saying point blank that the whole idea of free labor is off the table. In their system, the state has total, absolute authority over every single citizen. No apologies. And finally, we get to maybe the most utopian or craziest part of the plan. The Bolsheviks actually tried to create a moneyless society. They banned all private trade, and then they just printed so many rubles that the money became worthless anyway. It was called hyperinflation. So instead of a paycheck, you might get paid in food or shoes. And things like rent and public transport, they were just declared free.
And this ideology, it was baked into everything, even how you got your food. The ration system was explicitly based on your social class. Just look at these ratios from Moscow. A heavy industrial worker,
the ideal proletarian, got 4 times as much food as someone the state labeled bourgeoisie. And that person at the bottom, they might get just enough to not starve. This wasn't just about managing scarce resources, it was a weapon. It was deliberate, state-sponsored class discrimination, plain and simple.
So they put all these radical policies into action. The big question is, did it work? Well, to put it bluntly, it was a catastrophe. An absolute disaster on pretty much every single level you can imagine. The economic and, more importantly, the human costs were just staggering.
Just look at the economic numbers. By 1920, the country's total industrial output had crashed to just 20% of what it was before the war. That's an 80% collapse in just a few years. And for things like steel and heavy industry, it was even worse. The economy wasn't struggling, it was in a complete and total nosedive.
So what do people do when there's no food and no work in the cities? They leave, and they left in huge numbers. Petrograd, the very heart of the revolution, lost an incredible 70% of its people between 1918 and 1920. Moscow lost more than half. And here's the crazy irony. All these workers, the proletariat that the Bolsheviks were supposed to be championing, they fled to the countryside just to find something to eat, completely gutting the party's own social base.
And then we come to the most horrific result of all. That policy of seizing grain from the peasants, you combine that with a drought and the chaos of the Civil War, and you get the perfect storm for a famine of unimaginable horror. The estimated death toll? 5 million people. 5 million people starved to death. This was a tragedy, and a huge part of it was entirely man-made.
Look, you just can't inflict this level of suffering on millions of people and expect them to just take it. By 1921, the entire country had hit a breaking point. The whole Bolshevik project was on the verge of being completely overthrown, not by their political enemies, but by the very people they ruled. And suddenly, revolt was everywhere. You had massive peasant uprisings breaking out across the country. The workers in the starving cities were on strike. The secret police reported over 100 separate uprisings in just 1 month. But the real nail in the coffin, the thing that scared the leadership to its core, was the Kronstadt Rebellion. These weren't enemies. These were the sailors who had been the Bolsheviks' biggest, most hardcore supporters from the very beginning. When they turned, demanding an end to war communism, it sent a massive shockwave through the party. Lenin knew right then that the game was up. He had to change course, and he had to do it immediately.
And things moved so fast in early 1921. You've got the peasant rebellions getting worse in February. Then, bam, the Kronstadt sailors rebel in early March. The regime is hanging on by a thread. So, at the 10th Party Congress, held that very same month, Lenin gets up and announces a complete, stunning 180 on their entire economic policy.
This dramatic reversal was called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP, and Lenin didn't mince words. He called it a strategic retreat. What did it do? Well, instead of just seizing grain, they introduced a predictable tax. And crucially, they made small-scale private businesses and trade legal again. It was basically a frank public admission that their grand experiment, their attempt to jump straight into pure communism, had failed, catastrophically.
So what do we take away from all this? War communism was scrapped, sure, but its memory, its legacy, was burned into the nation's psyche. It really stands as this chilling, real-world example of what can happen when a rigid, utopian ideology is forced onto a messy, chaotic reality. And it leaves us with a really tough question to think about. How much suffering, how much devastation is ever justified in the pursuit of an idea? And at what point does a dream for a perfect world turn into a blueprint for an absolute nightmare?